Hi everybody, my name is Jeremy Siskind. I'm the author of a bunch of books that you should totally buy, like the Jazz Piano Fundamentals series. There's 3 books, as well as playing solo jazz piano. If you're not aware, I give a discount, a very good discount, if you buy packages of 3 or 4 books at my site. So check it out at jeremysiskind.com. Okay, so today I want to talk about one of the things that just endlessly fascinates me, which is this concept of counterpoint. And I want to do my best to address the question of what is counterpoint, what does it mean, and then to describe some ways that it applies to jazz, that it influences jazz, that it makes some jazz players maybe better than others, or maybe it just makes some jazz players different than others. So let's dive in. So counterpoint is oh no, I have no idea. Here's what I think is useful to think about counterpoint. Counterpoint is like a lens. What do I mean by that? Well, if you read a book, some scholars are going to read it with a feminism lens, right? They're going to read it looking for what is the book saying about female characters. Or they might read it through a historical lens, saying, well, is this actually historically accurate? And what was its historical influence? Or they might look at it through a poetic lens, being, oh, what's the kind of sound of the word and the rhythm of the words, right? These are all lenses that we can bring to seeing a work of art. So counterpoint, I think it's useful to think of as a lens like this. And it's a lens in which we're looking for the intertwined melodies that make up a piece. So instead of thinking vertically of what is each chord, right? Is this the 1 chord? Is it the 4 chord? Is it a C major chord? Is it a G minor chord? What we're looking at is not that's the kind of harmony, but we're looking at the horizontal element, and we're focusing on that piece. Said another way, counterpoint is that interaction between the vertical elements and the horizontal elements of the music. Now, it's related to this idea of species counterpoint. And species counterpoint is a very particular, very highly regulated study of counterpoint that most of the classical composers and many of the great jazz composers have engaged in, looking at specific ways that two or more melodies can interact. So species counterpoint is named, species is kind of a strange word for us, but there's different species of these exercises. Like first species is note against note. Basically thinking about the timing of if there's just 2 melodies happening at the same time. Okay. And then species 2 is 2 against 1, so like half notes against whole notes. Third is, so that'd be like, you could do it either the top voice has half notes, the bottom notes has whole notes, or vice versa. Right? And if you study species counterpoint, you learn about a few really key things. You learn about the different ways that these 2 voices can move. So they can move in parallel motion, the same amount. They can move in similar motion, the same direction, but different amounts. They can move in contrary motion, which is generally the most preferred method of contrapuntal moving, or they can move in oblique motion, where one voice stays the same and the other moves. You also learn to label consonances and dissonances and how to place them. There are very firm rules in species counterpoint about how many dissonances you can have in a row, about how they're supposed to resolve. And you also learn about the properties of melodies. There are rules about melodies. For instance, after a large leap, you must have a step in the opposite direction. You're also not supposed to have things like, this is one of my favorite words, tautologies, which is doing the same group of 2 notes twice. So species counterpoint, very interesting. But counterpoint and species counterpoint are not quite the same, right? You could have just bad counterpoint, right? Or you could look at something through this lens of counterpoint. Now, there are some pieces which are obviously what we would say contrapuntal, meaning that you can't really find chords, but you can find interlocking melodies. So there are some pieces that really invite this interpretation, right? Just like we might say that a book with a female protagonist, I just dropped my pen, excuse me, invites a feminist interpretation. When we see a Bach fugue or a Bach invention, this is an obviously contrapuntal piece. It doesn't really have any chords per se, or whatever chords it has are a result of the counterpoint, right? So if we have two melodies, I don't have like a Bach fugue right at my fingertips. So if we're hearing those clear voices, each coming in with melodies, then this invites us to think about it as a highly contrapuntal piece. But even if pieces aren't contrapuntal, or let's say that a different way, even if pieces aren't obviously contrapuntal, we can still analyze them from a contrapuntal framework. Like a great example of this is chorales. You know, if we think of a piece that kind of goes from right? Like in a certain way, what could be more vertical than that, right? Every beat has a chord, and we can easily label, you know, the 1 chord, the 4 chord, the 1 chord, the 5 chord, right? It feels incredibly vertical. And yet at the same time, if it's a well-written chorale, it should be written in 4 voices, right? Soprano, alto, tenor, bass. And we can not only analyze it in a vertical way, but we could analyze it to say the top voice does this, and then the middle voice I don't know, and the tenor voice does this. I'm making this up. It doesn't actually track. Right? And we could say that it has really good counterpoint if everything's moving smoothly and it's not defying some of these rules about dissonances, consonances, parallel motion, contrary motion. Okay. So even pieces that are not obviously contrapuntal can be viewed in a contrapuntal way. So let's talk about where in jazz counterpoint happens. So the most obvious place of counterpoint is between a melody line or, you know, solo and the bass. And one of the things that's maybe underrated about great bass players is that they're very good at forming good counterpoint. And this was something, you know, this is just an opinion, that I think is so underrated about Gary Peacock. Whenever he would play a ballad with Keith Jarrett, there would always be these just beautifully interlocking lines in a way that, you know, usually he was playing the root or a fairly obvious chord tone, and yet there would be some kind of magical thing happening that he was forming interesting counterpoint. So if we're playing solo piano, the great news is we're in charge of both the melody and the bass, and we can think about making things go in contrary motion. About creating something that's really interesting between the two melodies. That's an interesting framework. It's an interesting lens to use as a creator, right? How am I going to create counterpoint between those two voices? Another place as pianists that we really want to think about there being counterpoint. Actually, sorry. Before I before I stop talking about the melody and bass, it's worth saying that, you know, in something like the Bill Evans trio, where Scott LaFaro is more of a melodic instrument, now there's really a true counterpoint and more obvious counterpoint between the melody and the bass. And so it's really interesting to see that Scott LaFaro kind of style of bass from that vantage point, that it's almost like Bach. Bill Evans is playing a melody, Scott LaFaro is playing a melody, and they've got to interact in a logical way. So they're really doing some high-level listening and responding. So a slightly less obvious but very important place for us as pianists where we have counterpoint is... My pen's not working for some reason. That's interesting. That's really weird. All right, so you're just going to imagine me writing. Maybe it got set to totally white color. That is what happened. Okay, anyway, I'm going to keep talking. Is between the top note of your voicing and then the bass as well as the melody, right? So the top note of your voicing. Now, technically, counterpoint's going on between all the notes you're voicing, but generally we're going to try to bring out that top note of the piano voicing. That becomes a melody. So if you're comping, you want to form a smooth melody, right? You don't want to be jumping around unintentionally. You want to be usually playing some kind of a guide tone line with that top voice. So that's going to really influence the sound of the band. And notice, not only am I thinking about making it smooth, but I'm really bringing it out with my pinky. Right? It's not... Is it possible to bring out the other notes? Yeah, totally, it's possible, but it's not nearly as common as bringing out that top note. And then, we could delve into some obviously contrapuntal playing. To me, the most obviously contrapuntal pianist in the jazz tradition is Fred Hersch. This was one of his great innovations. When we think of Fred as an innovative pianist, one of the things that he really innovated is bringing much more obviously contrapuntal music onto the piano. So that could mean a lot of things. One of the things that he does is he'll just, in a solo performance, he'll play two lines of counterpoint, one against each other. And usually he'll do that first species of counterpoint. It won't be all whole notes, but he'll be usually playing at the same time. Other times I'll have more voices and kind of more variation, maybe there'll be kind of a constantly moving line. And some of his pieces, some of his compositions as well, highlight a more contrapuntal style. Chorale is a great one to listen to, or a ballad from his Songs Without Words. So let's do a little bit of review and wrap up. So I think of counterpoint as being like a lens to view things. It can be really useful to you as a performer or as a listener to think in those terms. It's not the only lens, but it's kind of a nice one. You can think of it like looking at a novel from a historical perspective specifically, or from a plot perspective specifically, or from a character perspective, specifically. It's always there, but whether or not you choose to view it is kind of up to you. Species counterpoint is a very regulated way of training to have good counterpoint, to write good melodies that most of the great composers in history have studied. The book to get, I hate it, but the guy's name is F-U-X. We pronounce it Fuchs because we do not like to swear on this channel. Okay, so species counterpoint is a very regulated way of learning how to play good counterpoint. There are also more, extremely obviously contrapuntal pieces. Bach is the most obvious thing that comes to mind. In jazz, there's counterpoint going on everywhere. Again, it's, whether you're going to put those glasses on and really choose to see it. So there's counterpoint going on, probably most importantly between the bass and the melody, but also between the top note of the voicing and the bass and the melody. And then if you want to tap into more obviously contrapuntal piano playing, I would say that Fred Hersch is the best place to start. Some of his acolytes like Dan Tepfer and Sullivan Fortner and Glenn Zaleski also play very contrapuntally. If you like nerding out to this level, then you're probably going to really like playing solo jazz piano. There's actually a whole chapter in here about a contrapuntal approach to solo jazz piano. So this would be the book for you. You can get it on Amazon, but much better, you can get it off my site. I'll sign a copy and send it over to you. Thanks for watching. If you have, if you've watched this far, comment with something that sounds like a swear word that isn't, like Johann Fuchs's last name. I might be getting myself into trouble. We'll see. Take care, you guys.